The belief in fake news has become a global issue as politicians, advertisers, and social media repeat unproven information. A new study currently waiting peer review takes a closer look at how easily people fall for fake news, even after being offered money for answering facts correctly. The research also found that repeated statements feel easier to process, therefore feeling more true than facts. Harvard's Nieman Lab dives into the study and says this technique of repeated lies and complicated statements was often on display during former President Trump's time in office. Nieman Lab's deputy editor, Shraddha Chakradha, joins me now to talk a little bit more about this. This is a really interesting article and an interesting study. And could you talk about the concept of illusory truth and the role that it plays?
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll get into how the study worked?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job of explaining it yourself, but it's basically this idea that repeating false claims makes it seem true. And so that's what illusory truth is. And as you can imagine, the more we hear things, whether they're true or not, the more likely we are to believe that they are true. And as you also mentioned, this was something that was on full display during the Trump administration. But it's something that we're seeing a lot more of in this so-called post-truth world that we live in, with news headlines that may or may not be true, and even items within news stories that may or may not be true. And it becomes harder for the brain to separate what's actually true and what's not.
Okay, so as quickly as you can, there were several parts to this study, but how did the study work? People were given statements that they needed to read. Most of them were true, but there was, a handful of them that were incorrect.
Yeah, that's right. So there, as you said, there are a few different parts to the study. And so for one part, people were given a set of true or false statements that they had to say were true or false. And these were trivia-like questions, just basic facts. For example, that the Angel Falls are in Brazil, which is false. The Angel Falls are in Venezuela. And then there was also a second component where people had to reason through a set of riddle-like questions, reason their way to a correct answer. So an example was, if you are running in a race and you pass the person who is in second place, what place are you in now? People might be tempted to answer first place, but actually you're in second place. And so the reason they had these two parts for the study was to see if more analytical thinkers could reason their way to a correct answer. And the thing that the researchers who are cognitive scientists, the thing that they were trying to test is whether telling people that they could be eligible for a $1 bonus if they answered correctly would make these people more likely to pay attention to the truth and, pay attention to getting the most accurate answers.
Mm-hmm. And they found that even with some sort of incentive to be accurate and to focus on the truth, that didn't really work. What was stronger than an incentive?
So that's the million-dollar question. What is stronger than an incentive?
Yeah.
And unfortunately for the researchers and unfortunately for us, an incentive didn't really seem to work. Now, there are a couple of caveats, right? These are, very basic facts. One thing is that I want to believe that people don't really have very strong emotions attached to statements like whether the Angel Falls are in Brazil or Venezuela. So it might be different if people were being asked about things like political beliefs or health information, whether the outcome would be different. But, when I spoke to the researchers, that's unfortunately the outcome, that we don't really know what it is that's better than an incentive to get people to pay attention to the truth. Now, one of the researchers involved in the study did a previous study where they tested whether if having people focus on accuracy by having them behave sort of like fact checkers and rating the truth of the statement, whether that would have them pay more attention to accuracy. And that seemed to work, but only if people had prior knowledge of a subject. So if they seemed to have some previous understanding of a topic, then they could act as fact checkers better. And then offering an incentive seemed to be better as far as getting them to the correct correct answer. But as you can imagine, when it comes to some of these more complicated topics like politics or health information, we don't really know where people's prior understanding is. So it can't really be a broad approach for the future.
So what does the role of repeated exposure play? Did repeated exposure play a role in this study? Because you write that the brain has a tendency to link repetition with the truth. So talk about that.
So the first step that they actually did was to have these people look at a set of statements just once. And in these statements were falsified statements as well, like the Angel Falls example that I gave. And they were trying to see if just having people look at something that could be false even one time was enough for that information to stick in their minds. And it was after they had this one previous exposure that they went on to take that quiz-like test and then the other cognitive test. So that's where the repeated exposure came into mind. And as the researcher told me, it was pretty scary to see that even just one prior exposure was enough to have a false claim sort of take root in somebody's mind.
Yeah, and so when I read that portion of the article, I thought about how often people just read headlines and never really read the body of an article. And so how that headline, which is deliberately being written to be catchy and, controversial probably to catch your eye, how that little factoid or statement can stick in your mind. But this idea that, repeated exposure, that our brain feels more comfortable with something that we're more exposed to and we're more likely to believe that to be true, that's kind of like biologically it makes sense. It's actually a smart thing for our brains to do, right?
Yeah, and that's what the researchers explained to me, that usually this works out in our favor. That's why we use things like rhymes or like mnemonic devices, when we're trying to study for a test. Like we've been taught through experience that if something happens over and over again, it's something that you can believe in. So generally and historically speaking, this has worked out in our favor. But now in this era of misinformation and disinformation and this post-truth world, it can be something that could get us in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I hope that we shed some light for some people who, are in a month going to sit down to Thanksgiving dinner maybe for the first time in a long time with family members who are going to have very different beliefs than them, and maybe we will shed some understanding, share some understanding here if they see this interview. Shraddha, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.